If you're a physical collector, then the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection might well appeal to you, at least on paper. We need to look at things like frame rates and performance, as well as the visual quality in all of those releases, because for many of us these were accessible quite a while ago on other platforms, and in some cases actually running a little bit better. Now with all of that said, thank you to Konami for the review code. As always, we're going to try and go over as many aspects as we can, including how it plays in handheld, things like download sizes for each of the releases, and also our thoughts on the ports themselves. Is Volume 1 indeed the Master Collection, or is it the Meh-ster Collection? Well, let's find out. Okay, so what's included then? Well, you've got Metal Gear Solid, the Master Collection version, which takes up 2.5 gigs, Sons of Liberty, which takes up 6.8 gigs, MGS3 Snake Eater, which is 10.7 gigs, Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, they're 618 megs, and finally the bonus content, which takes up about 378 megs, for a grand total of what's on the screen. Now straight away, if you're buying the physical version on Switch, what you've got on the cartridge, well, you've got Metal Gear MSX, you've got Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, Metal Gear the NES version, and Snake's Revenge, aka all of the tiny little files and everything else you're going to have to download. So it comes with a significant download, and that's the same on the Japanese version by all accounts. Not a good look. Digitally, it took me around 21 gigs to download it, and here's how things stack up. So I'll be honest, the one that I'm really looking forward to, that's been the Metal Gear 1, the very first PlayStation game that I played, certainly in this series, and I was expecting some really impressive things. Now we all heard already before it came out that it was running at 30 FPS, but I am quite surprised how much of a basic version we're getting here. This even goes down to the resolution. Now obviously we have a PlayStation port, and that's exactly what Konami wanted to do, but we live now in a world where old games get re-released in incredibly good and impressive fashion. Look at the Quake series, and even the Blade Runner point and click. They saw a lot of love and attention to bring them up to standard, but with Metal Gear 1 at the moment on Switch, is very much the old game stretched over your large TV. Now, in and of itself, that's okay, to some extent, but you would have hoped Konami would improve things like the text legibility. Text looks very blurry, and while they claim 30 frames per second, I have actually noticed that when you're peeking around the corner of boxes, you can very often drop that frame rate down to 20 frames per second. It's a case of sticking it on an emulator and launching it. That's basically what we've got here. You can press the L and R buttons simultaneously. This will bring up a menu allowing you to save. You can change the position of the game on your screen and the wallpaper, and also exit. But weirdly, that menu isn't actually available in all of these games. Now I know some of them weren't directly worked on by Konami, but a unified menu system would have made a lot of sense to me. What is good though is that the fact that we have classic Metal Gear Solid now on Switch, and when I'm playing in handheld, some of the issues, like the blurriness at least, look a little nicer for Metal Gear Solid 1. Other things that are nice to see are the different menu items, things like digital books. In particular, the Master Book is very cool. It features the Metal Gear full history over 35 years. It talks you through all of the games, and you can brush up on your Metal Gear knowledge. But I think the most interesting part of that for me was the chronology. It basically covers everything Metal Gear Solid and shows you where the games come in, where they cross over, across essentially all of the different media formats that it's been showcased and explored. Now, this version also has the VR missions, and again, even if you've downloaded the game, to access some of the content, there's further downloads. Things like the Japanese language pack, you'll need to download that if you want to access some of those VR missions. By bringing up that quick menu, you can remap some of the buttons, so you know the first person camera where if you look up it looks down, etc. You can actually remap the Y-axis, which is nice, but again not something you wouldn't have seen if you've played any of these on any emulator. I think an upscale of this version is kind of what I was expecting. I would have liked to have seen them try and just push that resolution up, because it really does stand out as dated, shall we say. But having something like a toggle between the old and the new versions, for me, would have shown a little more respect to such an incredible game. Now, when we move over to Metal Gear Solid 2, things certainly look a lot better. Obviously, I think this was either 2011 or 14, but it wasn't Konami that did the work on these, and they look much better. They run at native, which just looks significantly better than the first game. There was some controversy over the fact that these run at 30 frames per second as opposed to 60, which they originally released at, I believe. So I thought I'd do a little look into that on the Switch version, just to see how that frame rate holds up. Now, thankfully here, things are much better. we've got 30 FPS almost all of the time, and in fact there's 30 in some scenes that used to run slightly flawed. But here's the weird thing. There are certain moments where that 30 FPS cap will slip. So you'll actually see it fly up to 60 frames per second. There are certain cutscenes where it seems like that almost switches off. And I was even able to capture that happening as I exited an area. It leads me to believe that actually these could run at 60 frames per second on Switch. So the fact they haven't done that, again, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to me, other than Konami just saying we want it to play exactly like the original versions did. But again, why wouldn't you just have a toggle there? I'm not sure. Now, it might sound like I'm negative on this collection. It's more just expectations versus reality. And I think that in itself can be really useful when you're picking things up. The same really applies to Metal Gear Solid 3 as well. It's looking nice. It is definitely looking nice at HD resolution. The 30 FPS is consistent. And I remember playing this back in the day and just being blown away. Just thinking, wow, this is photorealistic. What I was talking about before with a consistent menu system really does apply to the second and third games here. Now, I'm sure again that back in the day you used to be able to hold down a load of buttons and do like a soft reset to get you back to the main menu. Here you have to use one of the terminals essentially that allow you to save your game, and then you can quit out to the main menu. But I kept pressing the L and R buttons hoping it would bring up that menu. You can't, and it's just a bit odd. Now, all of the games do come with those added extras, things like the master book, the chronology, and another area that I was pleased with are the general load times. They seem much better than I remember back in the day. I think players on some consoles are going to be really pleased because obviously they get the new achievements and stuff like that. Now, we know that's not something that applies to the Nintendo Switch version, but it might be a consideration again for those people looking for the best version of this collection. As far as any quality of life improvements, well, there are a couple of changes to some of the games. However, I wouldn't necessarily say there are any quality of life improvements. Obviously, the Switch doesn't have pressure-sensitive triggers, and that was used in one of the games. Instead, they replaced that by essentially remapping the same button to the left analog stick, but then never actually telling you that. But just rest assured, you can still perform all of the same actions. All of the content from the original games is here. This isn't a version where you're going to see anything removed, although you will see a few disclaimers, which in fairness, they may have been there in the 2014 release, but things like some of the aspects in this game may seem a little dated in terms of their presentation. They're basically pointing to certain things that they may not do in modern games, but it's all in there, so I can take a disclaimer as long as they don't strip out any content. Aside from the 3D games, you do have the older 2D titles, Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. They're actually very cool, and it was nice for me to go back and play those. If you've ever played a more recent release called Unmetal, you really can see the inspiration there. But then in the bonus content pack, you got a couple of, well, for me personally, less appealing releases. Sure, it's nice to have a little bit more from the universe, but I didn't particularly rate those games, I have to say. Now, gameplay-wise, you're going to be hard-pressed to say much negative about this series, not without getting flamed, but I will say a few things. I will say that if you've played more modern stealth titles and you think you want to go back and check out these originals, there'll be a moment where you really do have to adapt to what will feel like slightly clunky controls. Things like when you press the button and your character crouches down, you might be expecting to be able to creep around in that crouch position, but instead it will switch to going prone. Now that's just part of the series, you kind of have to get used to it. You can lean against walls and then strafe against surfaces, grab enemies, you can hold them up using your pistol. There will just be an adaptation period where you may think, hang on, this feels really dated. Certainly in the first game. But even with all of that said, the actual way that Kojima tells stories and introduces characters and some of the stealth mechanics, which essentially he helped to pioneer, they still hold up very well. These are great titles. To me, this feels like a preservation of a series rather than the perfect presentation of it. I do feel that a lot of people will have expected more from Konami to celebrate that 35-year history. And for me personally, specifically on the first game, 2 and 3, they feel great. And the other content, it's all fine. But some quality of life improvements for me, a few control tweaks, it wouldn't have hurt, it really wouldn't have. Sure, you do have Rumble in here, there's actually quite a nice bit of it. And as for the soundtracks, well, they are as good as ever. Now for the price, you obviously do get all of the games mentioned. You don't get Metal Gear Solid 4, it's very likely in my opinion that that will come in Collection 2. You do get the Western and Japanese releases of some of these titles, and also the graphic novels, books and comics. But then we have the price. You're looking at 50 quid or $59.99. And you could happily argue that in terms of content, you've got tons of the best games ever made. But you might also fall on the other side of the fence that says, well, actually the best parts of this collection, they've been available for about a decade in this format and actually run at a high frame rate. I think that's probably the reason we've seen so much extra stuff in here, like the videos with the graphic novels of Metal Gear Solid 2, and the digital art books, which I think there's actually 8 of them, and then obviously the soundtrack. If all of that had come on one cartridge in a physical copy, I think you'd be hard pressed to say it wasn't worth that. But for physical collectors purchasing it and then having to download a huge chunky update, it's going to be a bitter pill, I think. And Konami might want to think about going back to the drawing board if it's all possible and squeezing as much of that onto a cartridge as they can for a release later down the line, or at least in another region. So that's it, that's my take on the collection. Hopefully it's of some use to you. Let me know in the comments if you'll be picking it up. And as always, just a big thanks for watching SwitchUp. Thanks to our Patreons, our members, and all of you that enjoy the content. Hit the buttons, tickle things, and let me know what you think. And as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it SwitchUp. Cheers, guys!